So before the break, we were talking about how to define a function using a function expression or a declaration and such. Let's talk a little bit about parameters. So making our functions a little more robust, a little bit more useful. So I put a screenshot into Slack. So if a function did the same thing every time it was called, it wouldn't be a very powerful piece of code. We would also have to write a new function for each new feature in order to enable additional behaviors in our application. So in this example that I posted into Slack, this is a bad idea. So if we had a function, a hello mark function declaration that console logged hello mark, and then maybe we wanted to write a hello Rihanna function that console logged hello Rihanna, this isn't a good idea. So my question to you guys is, why is writing such specific functions a bad idea? Why is this not a good practice?
Since it only does that one thing and you can't use it in multiple circumstances, you're basically just writing more code. You could just write the console log hello mark instead.
Yeah, for sure. It's not very useful. We can't reuse it. It's not very dynamic. Yeah, Alejandra mentions we can't reuse it. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I mean, what if I had like 1,000 people, or what if I wanted to say hello to all of you fine folks in this class? Like, developers are pretty lazy, and we don't want to write more code than we have to. The fewer keystrokes, the better. So this isn't a very dry way to write our code, right? The whole point of functions is to write some modular code that's reusable. So this isn't really a great idea. Developers are very lazy. Yes, thank you, Christine. So the way that we can make this a little more purposeful is we can use parameters in functions. So parameters remedy this problem by allowing us to call or invoke the same function but with different values. And so if you look at this example in Slack, let's create a say hello function. Again, a function should do one thing and do it really well. And it should also be very specific and very descriptive in what it does. So this function is called say hello. So just off the bat, if I'm like a new developer to this team or something and I'm reading through the code base, I can pretty much look at this say hello function and probably get a good sense of what it's going to do for me. So being very descriptive is good, and having functions that only do the smallest thing possible with the most value is a really good way to structure your code. So this one is a say hello function. I can pass in name as a parameter. So this is much more flexible. I can do say hello Mark, say hello Rihanna, say hello whoever. So parameters really let us get the most value out of our functions. So in this example, the function say hello is declared with only one parameter. How many parameters can a JavaScript function take? Like, what's the maximum number of parameters that we could use when we define a function? Does anyone know that offhand? Someone want to Google that? Just Google it. Or you could ask Siri. I need to start incorporating more like Siri. Why am I getting function undefined Siri in my code? Yeah, so Matthew, yeah, it's 255. So we can pass a maximum of 255 parameters into a function. If you get to that point, you probably should rethink your code. I'd probably try to like create an object or something that you could actually pass into a function, but if that ever comes up in bar trivia, there you go, 255 parameters. So if we want to pass in multiple parameters, you can totally do that. You just want to separate those parameters with a comma, just list them out when you define the function initially. So in this example in Slack, if we were going to create a function sum, and if we wanted to make it a little more dynamic than what we did earlier, if we want to make this so we can actually pass in the values or the numbers, the variables that we want to add together, this function has X, Y, and Z parameters, and then it'll console log, the total of all three of those. And then you can see down below, if we invoke it using sum123, that should return 6. So parameters are our friend. One more section, and then we have a little bit of an exercise. So JavaScript is a loosely typed language. So what this means is that when you define variables, when you define functions, you don't have to specify the data type for that variable. And this is actually a pretty flexible and handy benefit of the language. Some languages, if I was going to define a variable var first name, I would have to define that this variable is going to be a string. It's going to contain a string. It can't contain a number or a Boolean value. Luckily, JavaScript's a loosely typed language, meaning when we declare a variable, we can put whatever we want to in there, which is pretty nice. While this reduces the amount of code that you must write, it increases the possibility of type errors. So if we define a function that's going to concatenate hello plus the name, the string that we pass in, like hello Mark or hello Rihanna, if we actually try to pass in a number to say like hello 22 or hello true or false or something, we really have no way of knowing what data type that function is expecting, which is something to be mindful of. And this is because in JavaScript, function definitions do not perform type checking on arguments passed into functions. So this is like kind of a good or a bad thing. It's, again, it's just something to be mindful of. Be very thoughtful when you're writing your code. And as a note here, parameters versus arguments. So we've talked a little bit today about like some semantic differences in how we name or how we refer to things. So parameters versus arguments, although used interchangeably, just FYI, the terms parameters and arguments have different meanings. So a parameter refers to the variables defined in the function's declaration, or when we first define it. We refer to those as parameters. Arguments refer to the actual values passed into the function when the function is called or invoked. And then you see the example there in Slack. So there, the first example, function do something. So when we first define the function, we would call that a parameter in the definition. But then down below, when we actually invoke that do something method, do something function, we would consider that an argument that we pass in. So again, just a really small, difference to be mindful of. That brings us to a little bit of an activity time. We'll take about 5 minutes to do this. I'll put it into Slack. Any questions as I'm putting this screenshot into Slack? Any questions about parameters?
When you asked how many is max, my initial thought was
sorry, you're on mute, Deb.
when you first asked how many parameters in a function, my initial thought was none. Or there is no limit, depends on memory for all practical purposes. And then someone said 255, but I was trying to search where that answer might have come from. I can't find that. I get the opposite.
Okay. Well, it certainly would depend on memory, but when we're defining a function, and again, if you're going to use 255
oh yeah, parameters, it's totally,
yeah, you'd want to redesign it. That's
yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of like a little FYI trivia bonus there. No worries. Let's get to the activity time. Let's take about 5 minutes for this. A little bit of practice. So write a function that takes a parameter. The function should simply console log the value of the parameter, then invoke that function with an argument, and then give me a thumbs up in Slack when you're done. So it could be any function. You can name it whatever you want. All right, we got 3 thumbs ups. Wait for maybe 1 or 2 more. I always feel like I'm doing like a pledge drive or something. Keep those pledges coming in, you guys. The phones are open. I feel like PBS is just one constant pledge drive. I don't know, it's weird. Probably especially around the holidays too. But they deserve every penny, for sure. Matthew, I don't know if we've heard from you much today. Matthew, you want to share your screen and mind walking us through the function that you created?
Sure, one sec. Cool, did that work?
Yeah, that's good.
So I put in the parameters of just random LA airports, and then assigned them the strings of worst, better, and best. And when I ran it, that's what came out in the console.
Nice. You don't have LBC down there?
No.
Or Orange County?
No, just those 3.
Yeah, LAX is worse. Yeah, I would agree with that. Cool, very nice. So you passed in multiple parameters. That's awesome. Cool, thanks for sharing. That actually leads us to our next little section. We'll touch on briefly, and then I want to put you guys into breakout rooms and work on a couple more exercises. I have you guys buddy up with your BFFs. So that leads us into passing in multiple parameters into a function definition. So obviously, as Matt just demoed, we can use multiple parameters in our functions. A function can take any number of parameters up to a limit, obviously. But so in this example, if we're going to create a multiply function, we can pass in a num1 and a num2, and then we would console log the product of those 2 numbers. And then when you invoke it, you generally want to supply the right number of arguments. So in this case, we're passing in 4 and 4. We're passing in 2 arguments because the function required 2 parameters when we defined it. If we didn't pass in 2 parameters, what would happen? If we didn't pass in 2 arguments when we tried to invoke the function, what would happen? Or what would happen if we tried to pass in too many arguments when we invoke the function? What do you guys think would happen?
Wouldn't it just use the last 2 parameters?
Yeah, it would use the first 2. So if we supplied 3 here, num1, num2, if we passed in 3 numbers as arguments, yeah, it would just use the first 2, yeah, and it would ignore the extra one. Yeah, very nice. So what if we only passed in 1 number to this function, 1 argument? Too little. Yeah, it would set it as undefined and get not a number. Yeah, so if we're passing in numbers, it would return not a number. If it was more of a string function, then it'd probably do something like undefined or something like that. Yeah, very nice. Cool. So yeah, you can pass in multiple parameters. You guys are pretty savvy at that for sure. So let me put in an activity here into Slack. I'm going to put you guys into breakout rooms, and let's get a little bit more practice here. So you guys will do this in pairs. Feel free to do this in Replit. I would encourage both partners to type it out as you're working on it. But you guys can work on the same functions, obviously. But write the following functions and test to make sure they work. So I want you guys to work on writing a function called calculate area that takes 2 parameters, width and length, and multiplies them to get the area. That'll give us the area of a rectangle. Invoke the function a couple of times with different arguments just to test it out, kick the tires. Then write a function that takes 3 parameters, 3 number data types, sums them, and converts the sum into a string. And then invoke that function a couple of times to get some practice. Kind of an extra bonusy type thing. Try to write a function that takes 2 parameters, strings, and then console logs whether the 2 strings are identical. And then there's some experiments. I just asked you guys those questions essentially, but if you want to play around with that in Replit, feel free. So any questions? I'm going to put you guys into breakouts and just have you get a little bit more practice with these. Any questions? All right. So yeah, we'll take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do this. Give me a thumbs up in Slack when you've completed the bullet points, just so I kind of get a gauge. Otherwise, I'll see you guys. I'll check in maybe like 10 minutes or so, see where you guys are. Bye.